We had 18 months to develop a car.
Hello everyone and welcome to my educational platform. This week it's another pleasure and honor to be welcoming Dr. Constantine Lyketsos. Dr. Lyketsos is a world authority in the treatment and development of Alzheimer's and related dementias. An active clinician, teacher, and researcher, Dr. Lyketsos was the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Neuropsychiatry Service, which he led for over a decade. He developed one of the largest and most successful academic neuropsychiatry programs in the USA, with special expertise in dementia and traumatic brain injury. Prior to taking leadership of the Johns Hopkins Bayview Department of Psychiatry, he was the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Division for Geriatric Psychiatry and Neuropsychiatry. He has held a joint faculty appointment at the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health since 1994. As the chair of the Academy of Psychosomatic Medical Task Force on Subspecialties, Dr. Lyketsos was instrumental in the 2003 recognition by the American Board of Medical Specialties of a new psychiatry subspecialty, which is called Consultation Liaison Psychiatry. His expertise in this area was critical to his leadership role in the Johns Hopkins Community Healthcare Partnership, which was supported by a major grant from the CMS Innovation Center, which basically transformed the way Johns Hopkins offers population-based healthcare to its local community. He now leads efforts to integrate behavioral health services throughout the entire Johns Hopkins medicine clinical enterprise. Dr. Lyketsos carried out pioneering work in the epidemiology and treatment of neuropsychiatric features of Alzheimer's and related dementias. Given his special expertise in the relationship between traumatic brain injury and dementia, Dr. Lyketsos advised the NFL Benefits Office and serves on the NFL Players Association Makey-wide Health and Safety Committee. Dr. Lyketsos is the recipient of the American College of Psychiatrists 2018 Geriatric Award, the 2016 Jack Weinberg Award on Geriatric Psychiatry, and the 2012 Distinguished Scientist Award from the American Association of Geriatric Psychiatry. He's the 2006 William S. Proxmire Award winner for extraordinary leadership in the fight against Alzheimer's, and the 2002 Research Award winner from the Academy of Psychosomatic Medicine. In 2019, he was installed as an honorary professor at the University of Ioannina in Greece. He's a fellow of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, a fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists, and also a fellow of the Academy of Consultation Liaison Psychiatry. He has authored/co-authored over 400 peer-reviewed articles, chapters, commentaries, and he has also authored 5 books. His work has been cited over 70,000 times with an H index of 144. A 2021 Stanford University study ranked him as number 13 out of 9,246 scientists all time, worldwide, in the field of geriatrics. Castle Connolly named him as one of America's top doctors every single year since 2001. Now, that is quite an introduction and a resume. Apart from his extensive experience and immense impact in the field of geriatrics, in the fight against Alzheimer's and related dementias, he's an exquisite character. And I'm honored that he was so approachable, and I had half an hour of his time so that I can transfer his knowledge, experiences, basically his reflection upon his very long, successful, and impactful career. This interview serves as a cradle of knowledge, as a point of reference for medical students, but also for anyone who is interested in understanding the impact such a scientist has had over the period of his career. Certainly, he's a personality that makes the country I'm coming from, Greece, extremely, extremely proud. I believe that the interview will speak volumes, way more than I can describe by just making a simple introduction. And I hope you find a sincere value in this interview in the same capacity I did.
I still remember the shock on his face when I told him that I was going to be a psychiatrist. His response was something to the effect, "Why are you leaving medicine?" And so there was a stigma against psychiatry then, in the same way that there is against our patients. And what really attracted me to Johns Hopkins was the work of two very prominent men, Paul McHugh and Philip Slavny. The idea that there's a broken part in alcoholism, for example, has been pursued for decades. Nobody's found one because there isn't one. What defines alcoholism is not that there's a broken brain. What defines alcoholism is the behaviors that people engage in. It's a challenge that I think we were up for, and it immediately kind of brought into play the competing constructs of care and cure.
Okay, great. So, as I wrote into my question leaflet, this interview is going to be based in two main pillars: your valuable contributions towards the care and cure of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and also your love and dedication to your craft, basically, to your science. So, I would like to take you back 45 years ago, 1980. And would you like to talk to me about moving to the US and working up to receiving the MHS in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins?
Sure. So I came to the US, as you said, in 1980. I did my undergraduate work in Chicago at Northwestern University, which is a beautiful campus in a sprawling suburban setting right on Lake Michigan. So you couldn't ask for a more beautiful place to begin your university studies. Downside was incredibly cold. I'd love to live in Chicago, but I can't tolerate the cold. So I studied psychology. I was a pre-med student. I'm pretty sure from the beginning I thought I wanted to be a medical student. And because of family influence, I was thinking psychiatry would be the field for me. So I spent 4 really good years there. I think it was a somewhat insular life because I spent almost all the time on campus, and so I hadn't quite gotten to know America during those 4 years. But I knew enough to get around, get a driver's license, get a social security number so I could get a driver's license, and the kinds of things that are key to starting out as a young person in the States. I then went to medical school in St. Louis. In those days, WashU was and still is top 5 med school, very competitive to get in. I don't know that I was that competitive, except I learned in retrospect that the dean at the time, a guy named Sam Gouset, who's a major figure in psychiatry, was looking for people applying to med school who said they were interested in psychiatry. So I think I was probably worthy of admission, but I think having stated that in my application was important to my attending a medical school of that caliber. Medical school is 4 years of drinking from the fire hose in the States. It's a doctoral degree, as you know, as opposed to in Greece, medical degrees are not doctoral degrees, they're undergraduate degrees. So it's a whole different level of training and intensity. You spend 2 years learning the language of medicine, learning about normal biology, learning about how biology goes wrong and how it can be studied in the laboratory. And then you spend 2 very intensive years playing doctor, so to speak, we used to call ourselves student doctors those days. And those were the days we had a lot more direct access to patients. Since that time, there's a lot more oversight by regulators and payers about what medical students can actually do. I don't know when that changed, but in my days in med school in the US, we had a lot of hands-on experience with patient care and a lot of independence. So I learned the ins and outs of mostly of hospital medicine, but also some outpatient medicine. We all rotated through different experiences, surgery, medicine, GYN, OB. And somewhere along the line, I realized that I loved surgery. And I was seriously thinking of becoming a surgeon. I loved it so much that I was at the top of my class in surgery and medical school, which is no small feat in my class. And because I was at the top of my class, the chair of surgery, a very famous man, Samuel Wells, assumed that I was going to stay there and train under him. It was sort of what happened those days. And so I was invited to his office to sort of talk about my being a resident in surgery at WashU. And by then I had settled on my mind that I did want to pursue psychiatry. I still remember the shock on his face when I told him that I was going to be a psychiatrist. His response was something to the effect, "Why are you leaving medicine?" And so there was a stigma against psychiatry then in the same way that there is against our patients. It's different, it's better, but it's still, psychiatry is still thought of somewhat differently in the medical field, so much more in those days. Mm-hmm. So I then came to Hopkins to do residency. It's a 4-year training program in psychiatry. And I could have written my ticket. By then I was a top 5% student in my medical school class at a good school. I had some publications and research, so I had my choice of where to go to do residency. And what really attracted me to Johns Hopkins was the work of two very prominent men, Paul McHugh and Philip Slavny. So you got to appreciate this. It's around 1988, and psychiatry is struggling with its identity. In those days, there were the orientation wars, because explanations for psychiatric disorders that were purely biological or purely psychoanalytic were sort of contrasting each other. It was very interesting because this contrast of orientation seemed to have reached a kind of what we would call in the States a Mexican standoff. I'm not sure that it's even an appropriate term to use in the days that we worry about racist implications, but it was basically a standoff. And what I loved about Hopkins is that they had developed thinking of a way to move forward. And the way to move forward in the eyes of Paul McHugh and Philip Slavny, who became my teachers, is to appreciate that psychiatry is dealing with very heterogeneous conditions. They're not heterogeneous just in how they appear, the kind of symptoms they have, the changes in patients or behaviors that they see. But they're heterogeneous in that they have different kinds of causal origin. So medicine is very focused on what we call the disease perspective. You know, you have a cough, you have chest pain. We're looking for a tissue that's abnormal, a broken part. We want to understand why the tissue is abnormal and why it's broken and fix it. That's basically biological. Yeah. And that does exist to some extent for psychiatry, but it can't explain all the conditions we have. So the idea that there's a broken part in alcoholism, for example, has been pursued for decades. Nobody's found one because there isn't one. What defines alcoholism is not that there's a broken brain. What defines alcoholism is the behaviors that people engage in. So it would take a long time to explain the theory of the perspectives of psychiatry. We'd say there are 4 kinds of explanations: behavioral explanations, personality explanations, disease explanations, and life story explanations. So I saw that, and I still do, as a way of moving past the orientations war. Is it psychoanalytic or biological? So that attracted me. I came here, I trained. I think the training was exceptional. What made the training exceptional was exposure to very large numbers of patients. We saw well over 1,500 patients during those 4 years. So we got a sense of the full breadth of the problems that patients face. Again, psychiatry programs at the time, you have to appreciate, most of them were very therapy oriented. And in therapy, you see a small number of people and you see them over and over for a long time, and you work with them in psychotherapy. Very different from the training I had. So I had a training that I think gave me a broad scope and confidence, and it's no surprise that graduates of Hopkins Psychiatry are highly sought after as clinicians. So somewhere in residency, I had to make the decision, what is my long-term career? And I decided that I wanted to continue to do psychiatry research. And I was interested primarily in epidemiology. And so the methods of clinical epi, which includes doing clinical trials. And so after residency, I did the Masters of Health Science that you referred to at the School of Public Health. So that was coupling an interest in brain diseases with the methods coming from the top down to explain clinical phenomena. And then the methods also that help you understand causes, and the methods that help you develop treatments, which is what's called analytic epidemiology and clinical trials. So that gets us to the MHS. And
therefore, the ambiguity. Yeah.
Hmm?
No, please go on, please.
Go on where? Do you want me to? Because you asked me to go through the Masters in '94, and I got.
No, yes. I thought you had something else to say. No. So I assume that ambiguity, as far as psychiatry is concerned, together with your MHS in epidemiology, sparked an interest in research. Therefore, after, am I correct?
Yes, you are. You are correct. And so, I think for most people at my level will say that there are fortuitous junctions in their career that offer them opportunities that might not have been offered otherwise. So there were two very, very important professors at Hopkins at the time. A guy named Marshall Folstein, who had put together something called the mini mental state, a very widely used measure for cognition in clinical settings, and a man named Larry Toon, who was a geriatric psychiatrist, and they were both studying dementia, and they were both interested in neuropsychiatry, which is really the psychiatry of established brain disease, so Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, epilepsy, et cetera. So they both fortuitously left Hopkins at the same time in '93. And that created a big vacuum in that there was nobody senior to take on the mantle of neuropsychiatry and move it forward. So Paul McHugh, who was the chairman at the time, must have seen something in me that I hadn't appreciated. And he said, I want you to take over these programs and make something with them. And I'm going to give you support and resources for the next few years so that you make something of it. So I took advantage of this opportunity. The Marines say carpe diem. We need to come up with a Greek term of the equivalent. Vastikse την ημέρα or piasse την ημέρα, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can.
Yes, it's piasse τη μέρα απ' τα μαλλιά, ίσως.
Piasse τη μέρα απ' τα μαλλιά. Okay, so I did that. And so, and another fortuitous thing that happened at that time, the idea of how you treat people with Alzheimer's in the long term was really in its infancy. So we're talking not many years ago, people with dementia and Alzheimer's, whose numbers were growing, were essentially warehoused. They were either warehoused at home and hidden or warehoused in institutions. And so those days, facilities that had as residents many people with dementia were interested now in, okay, this 85-year-old is going to move into my facility, which is a retirement community. They have dementia. They're going to live here for 5 or 10 years. What do I do to maximize their life quality? So there was an institution called Copper Ridge that approached us at Hopkins and said, let's develop a plan of care. Let's develop a theory. Let's develop an approach to how you treat people with dementia. And the numbers are growing. I'm sure you can quote a lot of statistics. You know, we're going to hit worldwide about 130 million people with dementia alive in roughly 2050. Some variation of those stats. So this was a challenge that I think we were up for, and it immediately kind of brought into play the competing constructs of care and cure. So cure really refers to, we've got a brain disease, The field as a whole is understanding the genetics, the pathophysiology, the brain changes, and at some point we'll come up with a cure, meaning that the disease will go away. That's very hard to do with brain disease because the brain is complex, but there's always an effort towards cure. But what you learn, or what I learned, is that these are people who live with a brain disease for many years, and it's important to come up with a theory and an approach to look after them. So we developed the 4 pillars model of care that has been written about, and there's also a book called Practical Dementia Care. And the idea is, first of all, if you have someone where you suspect dementia, you want to diagnose them properly and use all the modern tools available. But then you've got to be thinking in terms of how you look after them for the average of 10 years that they're going to live after diagnosis. And so we came up with, we got to have a disease management. So if there are basic causal changes that we can modify, simple enough. Blood pressure elevations accelerate the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Managed blood pressure is not just a means of managing blood pressure, but it's a means of disease modifying the course of someone with Alzheimer's. And there are many other examples. So disease therapies, then there's symptom therapy, which has to do with supporting memory loss or compensating for it. A big field of symptom support has to do with the neuropsychiatric symptoms. Everybody with dementia gets some kind of symptom like depression, agitation, delusions, hallucinations. So they're very intrusive symptoms. How do we treat them? And then the 2 other pillars are support for the patient. So creating a structure where they can live safely, but where you maximize their independence and their quality, and support for the caregiver. So this was the appreciation that you cannot think of someone with dementia as being alone. Almost everyone is with a caregiver. It's usually a family member. It's usually a spouse, more often a wife than a husband. It might be a kid. It might be a sibling. Occasionally, it's a parent. I've treated a number of folks where the parents are the caregivers because the onset of the dementia is at a pretty young age. So this kind of 4-piece approach to looking after people with dementia is something that we implemented at Hopkins. We've written about, others are implementing in many other places. And we're using that as the infrastructure to bring in cure-oriented therapy. So therapies that are getting more at the basis for the disease, recognizing we're not likely to have a cure that takes this away. Alzheimer's, dementia, and other forms are so inextricably linked with aging that it's very difficult to stop these brain diseases. So we're always, or at least for many, many years still, we will have this challenge. Well, we'll be inching closer to effective disease therapy, but we still have to take care of people. So my interest in research was, okay, so how do I develop the ability to demonstrate that this care approach works? So we've done that in a variety of ways, a variety of projects. How do I bring new thinking for improved treatments? So an example where I think we've had our most impact, I mentioned that everybody with dementia develops neuropsychiatric symptoms. A very common one is this thing called agitation, where patients are anxious, distressed, worried. They might be up and pacing. They occasionally get aggressive, occasionally violent. And this can be intermittent. So they might have days where they're doing well, but then they might have a day where they are just up in arms all the time. So this syndrome of agitation for decades was thought of as a form of agitation like schizophrenia. And so because many of the patients have delusions and hallucinations, they were being given antipsychotic medicine. Well, in the late 90s, early 2000s, it became evident that antipsychotics are only a little bit effective and they're very risky. So clinical trials were done that didn't clearly demonstrate that they were better. So we said, okay, maybe this idea of thinking of this agitation in Alzheimer's as kind of having something like schizophrenia. Let's think of it as a problem that's specific to Alzheimer's. And let's understand what about the Alzheimer's brain disease might be causing this agitation condition. And one of the things that became evident, this wasn't our research, was that this is very much linked to degeneration in the brain of what's called the serotonin system. And so that basically speaking very crudely, people with agitation, at least many of them in Alzheimer's, are deficient in brain amounts of serotonin. So we then said, why don't we try widely available serotonin drugs? These are antidepressants. And we did a number of trials, and one very important clinical trial called CITAD, using the antidepressant citalopram. We published our results in 2014. We showed how effective this drug is for agitation, and it's been a complete sea change. So since that time, almost everybody, when they first get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, even when they probably shouldn't, go on an SSRI drug so as to prevent or manage the agitation, which makes a huge difference down the line. So there's one example of how this theory allowed us to hone in deeply using the methods of clinical epidemiology to demonstrate the value of a particular treatment that now everybody's using. So they weren't using it before. Now, the field as a whole right now is struggling with, there was a hypothesis called the amyloid hypothesis. And this basically said that Alzheimer's is due to the accumulation in the brain of these sticky proteins called amyloid. And billions of dollars have been spent to remove the amyloid. Lots of medicines are effective, some injectable, some oral, in removing amyloid, but it's very, very modestly effective to help symptoms, to help patients. So if amyloid is not the cause, and if amyloid is not going to be the full pathway to a cure, what do? And so what we are propagating now is the precision medicine idea. We founded in 2019 a precision medicine center in Alzheimer's disease at Hopkins, which I direct. This was supported largely by families of means who were afflicted in their family members. And they said, this amyloid stuff's not working. We need new ideas. You guys at Hopkins have this concept that it's not one disease. And so precision medicine basically saying the reason amyloid is not working is because you're giving it to everyone. And you're not paying attention to figure out who are the subgroups where amyloid is the driver of the symptoms. And then what do you do for everybody else where amyloid is more an incidental finding and not the driver of the symptoms? And so we've come up through our Richmond Center, as it's called after the family that has been our greatest supporter. And the goal right now is to think of various forms of subtyping. And I don't want to get into details, it would take a while, but we have about 4 or 5 subtypes that we are systematically thinking about. And we have a 15-member faculty. Most are full professors here at Hopkins. And so they each are running the projects. And my job is to bring them resources and promote the ideas that will define subtypes that will have their own specific treatment.
Your research efforts, therefore, have landed you the Jack Weinberg Award from APA as well. So at this point, I want to also talk about the contributions of your team, because without a bonded and efficient team, you know very well that this wouldn't be possible. Can you talk to me about the efforts leading up to that award?
Yeah, so I think the Weinberg Award, this was a number of years back, and it was from our premier psychiatric association, the American Psychiatric. I've had other awards in geriatrics, was sort of a recognition of impact, of research impact. And I think it pretty much centered around the citalopram study that I cited before. But you're very correct. I was honored by President Sakelaropoulou a few months ago with an Argo Award. And if you had a moment to go look at the video, you would see that I very specifically, when I was given a few moments to thank, I very specifically said that I am simply representing a team. I'm simply representing people who, you know, perhaps I'm some sort of a catalyst. Maybe I'm good at choosing collaborators who work well with each other. Maybe I'm good at articulating an idea of what specifically it is. Maybe someone has something that they haven't quite formed and I help them do that. But ultimately there's, and I already referred to about 15 people in our Precision Medicine Center. And these are largely folks I've collaborated with over the years at Hopkins. So yes, my team is it. I think my role has basically been more of an orchestrator or a maestro. as opposed to someone who's at the front lines right now. I used to be in the front lines, but I'm much less so. And I think that's a great, so one lesson for science is carpe diem. Take the opportunities. Most people realize their opportunities, so take them. And then the second one is become a team player. Learn how to develop a team, learn how to manage a team. And a third lesson that I would say that I've often said to my team, and I think applies when I try to mentor younger people, is everybody comes to me, especially in this climate, and says, well, I have this great idea. How am I going to pay for it? So everybody starts worrying about money, and that ends up being a roadblock. And what I say to them is, that's the wrong thinking. You do what you love, you do what you're good at, and the money follows. And that's certainly been the case with my career. I found ways, and so you start off by doing inexpensive research. You start off by working with people who have money, who might give you a corner of their laboratory, so to speak, and allow you to articulate what you're doing. And then over time, if you're good at what you're doing and your idea is good and you stay focused, people will start giving you money. Either it'll be NIH grants, which can be very large. We've raised, as I said, a lot of money from philanthropy, from grateful patients at Hopkins who like our vision. Governments will step up. Industry leaders will step up. We're working very closely with a company that's developing deep brain stimulation for Alzheimer's disease, implanting electrodes in the brains of patients in a pacemaker-like fashion. There's evidence that this is going to work, at least for some people, in helping symptoms and delaying progression. So yeah, carpe diem, build a team, and do what you love, and the money will follow.
Absolutely, and this is a great advice, because as a young individual, I am also caught up in the game of money. So because I'm very much conscious of time, my final question would be about the future. So I have read about you being interested in future applications of the artificial intelligence. Could you talk me through some of these applications for the future?
Yeah, I think
research?
I think our so this has to do with a couple of efforts. And they all circulate around the fact, what do you do when you've got volumes and volumes of data? So in our precision medicine center, one of the privileges that we've been afforded is access to the data in the electronic health records, the medical charts of Hopkins patients. And people 65 and older, we have access to those medical records, of course, anonymously and with identifiers removed. But right now, we're probably close to 140,000 individual medical records. Each medical record has tens of thousands of variables in it. And we're trying to make sense of this in various ways. And so you need people who are data scientists who can use artificial intelligence methods to do data reduction, either to generate hypotheses or to test hypotheses, or a combination of the two. So that's clearly one area that we're very interested in with artificial intelligence. The other area has to do with analysis of brain images. So when you have a brain MRI, which is one of the tools of our trade, or if you've ever seen an image of an MRI, but an experienced doctor can look at it and they can interpret it and say, well, I'm seeing this there and I'm seeing that there. But the thing about MRIs is that these are digital images. And doing a visual read leaves a lot of information on the table. So if you start getting into, well, what's really in an MRI, you can appreciate that there have to be ways to use artificial intelligence to extract digital information that the human eye and human brain cannot generate on its own. One example is measuring the volumes of different smaller brain structures on the right or left side. And working with very, very smart colleagues in radiology here at Hopkins, they are doing exactly that. So an MRI is acquired under a certain protocol. and it's fed into what's called a pipeline. It's an analysis project. And the pipelines produce different kinds of information. So the first kind of information that's turning out to be very useful is the volume of close to 200 brain structures. And the relative size of these 200 brain structures in someone with Alzheimer's symptoms seems to tell us something about who's got a worse form of the disease, who's going to respond to this medicine or that medicine, or whose condition is going to progress faster. It's just one small example where you take these hundreds of millions of pieces of information in the digital MRI image, and you spit out summary information about 200 areas, and then you can look at patterns of atrophy to predict something about medication response or progression. And you can generalize this to many other imaging modalities and also to genetics, DNA analysis. So I think those are two areas, well, adding genetics will be the third, that are going to be really critical and important to our work using AI.
It veers off from what you're saying extremely to interpretation of data, which is vital on what you're doing.
Well, it's the linking of the two, right? I mean, this is data that's focused on a particular set of conditions.
Of course. So, Mr. Lyketsos, I would like to thank you for your valuable time. This was very insightful for me to be able to listen to your journey and the small details of your research and exactly the rationale that exists behind your research. It's extremely insightful for me to be able to listen to that. And I'm sure the students who will read this article will be enlightened into what exactly you're doing. And if you want to, I will send you feedback because I have a lot of students who are approaching me, giving me feedback on my articles on the university campus. So if that makes you happy or fulfilled.
Yeah, I welcome the feedback. And best of luck with what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.